right, 1 second. Okay. Hello, everyone.
Sorry. I'm just making sure that everything's okay. 1 second. Sorry, John. Sorry, John. Okay. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the 2020 Austin Ivy Plus Virtual Speaker Series, hosted here in Zoom and streaming live on YouTube from Austin, Texas. My name is Stephanie Pace. I'm a realtor here in Austin and the president of the Cal Alumni Club of Austin, an affiliate chapter of the Cal Alumni Association at UC Berkeley, and an active social professional organization of more than 300 Cal alumni living in Austin, Texas.
And my name is Jennifer. I'm a pharmacist in Austin and vice president of the Cal Alumni Club of Austin. This event not only represents UC Berkeley, but also represents the Austin Ivy Plus, a collection of over 1,000 Austin-based alumni from all the Ivy League schools, the Seven Sisters, and several prestigious private and public universities. Tonight, we're highlighting the incredible work of Austin-based star John Chen. Here's a little bit about his mission and background.
Rapid growth underpinned by a thriving technology sector and cultural scene has led to Austin's characterization as a superstar city. However, Austin's challenges with housing inequity and affordability reflect the same challenges faced by regions such as the San Francisco Bay Area. This talk explores the consequences of decades of land use policy decisions and the latest efforts to address the housing situation.
John Chen is an alum of Stanford University and first moved to Austin to attend law school at UT. He began his career as an M&A and corporate attorney in New York and Hong Kong at Davis Polk before moving to San Francisco to represent clients in the tech startup and renewable energy space. John returned to Austin to pursue a longstanding interest in real estate development and investment.
We have one request for our audience. Please mute your audio when our speaker is talking and remain muted until audience Q&A. If audio does become an issue, we will be forced to remove you from tonight's event.
Now we're ready to hear from John. Take it away.
All right, thank you, everyone, and thank you especially to the Cal Alumni Association of Austin and the Ivy Plus Society of Austin for giving me the opportunity to discuss one of our most pressing social issues in our community. And with that, I'll begin the presentation now. Wait, give me 1 second. Let's see.
Okay. You're good, I think.
I'm trying to.
Right here.
Excuse me. There is an issue with Zoom sharing PowerPoint. I apologize for this.
Oh, it's okay. You can, on the bottom, you can see share screen, and it'll share either the document that's popping up or your entire full screen or a section of the document that you have open.
Okay.
Now go to.
Can everyone see the screen?
Yes, it's perfect.
Okay. Thank you for that great introduction. So we'll be scrolling past this slide. All right. So I'll begin the analysis by discussing the ways that sociologists and people who study urban poverty and housing issues characterize different types of housing inequality. And so there are two primary traditional models. One of them is the economic inequality model. And in that model, housing inequalities such as the lack of income to purchase rent, the lack of availability of high-paying jobs that create compensation necessary to both participate in the rental market as well as the sale market are the primary way of looking at how to address the issue. Essentially, this is the traditional view, and solutions typically center on increasing available resources to housing market participants. That would mean increasing income, such as through unionized jobs, promotion of industries that are highly compensated, so that the idea being housing is essentially the participation in a market transaction, and the inability to do so is an economic issue that can be solved by pushing more money towards those participants. While this has many explanative benefits towards the situation, the sociologists have kind of identified that there are further issues that kind of hamstring a housing market participant, especially those who are people of color or marginalized minority groups, from accessing the housing market. In these cases, the research has shown that economic inequality is insufficient to explain why they have not been able to access safe, affordable housing that meets their needs. This could be because people who are in a unionized job may be paid the same as their coworkers. However, because of minority status or some other characteristic, landlords have been denying them housing. And the research has shown this to be the case, especially with evidence of behaviors such as redlining. Redlining is something that will appear multiple times in this presentation because it has been described as such a fundamental barrier to the accumulation of wealth that has, in many cases, been passed down through generations and yielded an advantage for those who've had it. And that makes real estate one of the unique assets, in the sense that passing down privilege is actually something that may not be that easy, given how expensive things are, but access to a safe neighborhood with good schools that's convenient to high-paying employment, and ownership of property that can be financed with relatively small down payments. That's why redlining is important. And it has only become more important over time as the value of these properties has appreciated faster than the rate of inflation typically. And that puts the owners of such properties in the position of an ever increasing dividend from one original good decision. And with that, the transition is to superstar cities and geographic inequality. This is where the current scholarship around housing centers more and more. And the reason why is that sociologists have identified that rapidly growing cities and regions, often with a technology or creative component, in this case, think the Bay Area, Los Angeles, New York, Chicago, DC, these areas are known for being high opportunity, and yet what has been one of the persistent questions about inequity is that the burden of housing in these cases, in these environments, actually has a significant effect of essentially taking back and rebalancing those employment and educational opportunities. And in those situations, some of the ways this is manifested is a mismatch between very rapid creation of jobs and very slow development of housing. And one way to look at that is the restrictiveness of land use regulations in those regions. Together, what this does is that it freezes the access to opportunity. And in many of these places, what is visible is that there is a clear discussion that these places are, quote unquote, in leadership of major major industries, and people often talk about how much they have grown. But the way that I would say to look at this is to say that when one looks at the housing stock in the Bay Area, it's very different from the office stock. And in that case, people often say, this neighborhood looks completely different. It has changed so much. This is often the case in Austin or the Bay Area. But if you take a really close look, that change is often through the development of retail properties or office properties, corporate headquarters. When you look at the actual housing stock in Austin or in the Bay Area, so much of it was built before the 1980s. And that means that many of the most desirable neighborhoods have had generations who have benefited from ownership of these highly coveted and extremely well located parcels. In fact, as people have reviewed the social issues in these areas, one of the repeated discoveries was that insufficient housing is not necessarily the failure of a market transaction, but it's the foundational cause of inequality now. In that sense, what are we saying? We're saying that the issue is not about whether people can afford rent in a vacuum, but that the high cost of rent leads to the denial of opportunity, leads to the inability of people who have not been in these areas for long periods of time to access the rich opportunities of jobs and possibly economic and social mobility that are all possible if there were further opportunities to interact with that space. And so, just to kind of break down the impact of these anti-development housing policies and to see their relationships, I've kind of highlighted how in yellow the superstar city analysis framework encompasses both economic analysis in green and social analysis in orange. And that's a category kind of placeholder that you'll see throughout this presentation in a way to help make this topic that's often very dense easier to follow. And so first of all, as we look at the first bullet, it seems pretty obvious to many people that competition for scarce housing will increase property values. When this happens, it's very interesting because there are certain arguments that increasing property values create gentrification and displacement, but at the same time, increasing property values are a way for existing residents to access the value that they've built up and to put them on a path towards acquiring assets. However, as we go down this analysis, it'll become more clear how these issues are interrelated and often serve to freeze out the existing residents of these communities, denying them opportunity that would otherwise be available to them and leading to the kind of notorious nature of this problem. And so the next one is that limited supply of new housing emphasizes single family. In many cases, this is a choice for people who have wanted to be in a single family home, but it is also a policy outcome. And as we'll see in the next few slides, the preference for single family housing is deeply entrenched in many of these places. And especially the tip of the superstar city collection, the coasts on both sides, Austin being one of the exceptions that is not on the coast. And so as the limited supply of new housing emphasizes single family, this prevents diversity in ownership and renting as well, because single family homes necessarily take up more space. And what we'll see is that there is a limited amount of land available within the central corridors of our cities. And this essential balance of accommodating new residents when we have limited supply of land to build upon is one of the drivers of the displacement of vulnerable populations. And in that sense, as populations try to make it work with multiple jobs, multiple multiple people living under the same roof, many will decide that it's simply not worth it and sell. And in many cases, the complexity of the system reduces accessibility to opportunity. And what does that mean? It means that existing inequities in wealth and especially political connections, and so in that case, it's just the social capital of the residents, will often be insufficient in order to conduct the lobbying missions and such necessary to actually build in one of these supply constrained markets. And this is where you see outside actors such as developers and real estate investors often being accused of taking a disproportionate share of profits from communities. And so as we transition to the next slide, I thought one of the ways to look at the issue of housing is to divide this into periods of time. And in this case, if you look at the pre-1960s situation in Austin, Austin was no different from many other southern cities in that the Jim Crow era was alive and well. And in those cases, discrimination often took overt forms and were very much both racist and similarly also classist. And in that sense, one of the ways that this is visible in is in the forced relocation of minorities to newly created districts. That's what happened to the African-American population in the 20s. And these moves led to the distancing of the African-American population from high opportunity areas such as the former African-American communities of Clarksville and such near downtown, and the construction of dense segregated housing also cut off from downtown. And this was also the era of redlining. And the next era is the 1960s and 1980s through 1980s. And in this era, federal fair housing legislation began to be passed. This was when regulations led to the reduction in such overt racist practices. It even prevented classist-based forms of discrimination. For example, fair housing laws now prevent the advertising of housing as family-friendly, for people who are of a certain level. If you look at housing in the past, this was one of the major issues. Yet at the same time, issues continue with segregated neighborhoods still experiencing a lack of opportunity. In the midst of all this, one of the major land use changes happened in 1986, and that was the passing of a new zoning code for Austin. And prior to 1986, there was zoning in Austin, but much of the zoning was based on categorizing of uses. So it's to prevent single-family homes from being next to industrial uses or residential uses that are separated from dense commercial uses. As the context of this is that at the time this passes, Austin ranks relatively highly for affordability. This is the era, if you talk to an old Austinite, that housing was not a burden for certain people. It was possible to find, an apartment for $400 or such, old stories of that type. But with the passing of that law, supply begins to tighten and common building types are outlawed. That's a point that we'll return to in the next few slides. And this is a trend that continued on all the way through the financial crisis and then through around 2015. And this was when very well-connected NIMBYs, infamously from a few wealthy Central Austin neighborhoods, added layer upon layer of complexity to the Austin code, which made it very difficult to develop anything other than single family homes. And the coordination of this was part of the idea to make neighborhoods quote unquote compatible with existing uses. In that way, the neighborhoods were also not allowed to evolve with the fact that Austin had changed from a relatively sprawling city into a increasingly dense city with increasing diversity. Following that, we're kind of in the era of reform. I believe that since the way to divide this up was that anti-development legislation had begun to slow down, and the consensus had become that we are going to have to find a way to accommodate new residents, make real estate something that doesn't generate additional burdens and cause existing residents to have to leave. And so the question is, how has Austin been able to restrict housing construction of all types or diverse types? And this is one way to visualize the problem, is that these laws, I would think that one of the concerns is that isn't the purpose of these laws to make housing safer or more attractive, but I argue that the laws have instead essentially banned the construction of housing that we consider very routine and provides shelter for thousands upon thousands of Austin residents. Just a quick kind of way of going through this. At the top left, you'll see these apartments that are, pretty well laid out, in my opinion. They allow for density without creating too much of an issue for neighbors. In fact, if this were to be built now, it would probably be built as a very dense mid-rise apartment building. But what you'll see from this is that one way housing is affordable in this case is that there's no underground parking, and there's no parking structure. How parking is instead up front. This is one of the most identifiable features that the city has done. People who don't want this style of development are essentially adding thousands of dollars per unit. What I've heard is that underground parking can run up to $100,000 per unit right now, and that really makes any future construction of the more luxury type. Number two is just fairly standard single family home. You'll see that there's some pretty large trees next to it. The fact is that under current rules, that house really can't be built because the houses are too large and too close to the trees. And so I don't necessarily want to be seen as picking on trees, but this essentially means that many lots in Austin are actually undevelopable just because someone once planted a few trees in the backyard, and without the understanding that decades later, those trees would prevent them from ever selling their house really to one of the major buyers, which is developers, means that even those who are displaced and leaving may be getting hundreds of thousands of dollars less for property that is largely similar to one next door. And so yeah, let's see. Okay. Same bottom left, housing is laid out in a way that's not allowed currently, and housing photo to the right, same thing. Relatively kind of quirky looking Austin house is built too close to trees, and doesn't necessarily have set aside parking areas, and so. The key for this is to think about the system, and the question then becomes, to me, how can we improve supply if increased supply would help to create greater opportunities for people to live in more diverse communities? And so one of the kind of representative photos I have is that of a new construction site in East Austin. What I see here is that this is denser housing that is often surrounded by single family homes. And what you'll see here is that this is one of the rarer cases where developers were able to put together a site that has denser housing that is different from the single family model. And in many cases, such projects weren't even feasible a couple years ago because there was insufficient demand to cover the costs of one of these projects. And so one of the points that I'm trying to make is that we're in a once in a generation opportunity with the east side of Austin to ensure that the remaining large parcels that are there are built sensitively to accommodate greater density, because what is interesting is that if you go back just 5 years ago, land values on the east side were insufficiently high. And in that case, what you would have seen here instead would have been 5 single family homes or 10 single family homes. And instead, you're getting dozens of units where if people have roommates, this could be one to 200 people instead. And part of our concerns of this, of course, is how to do this while also not burdening certain neighborhoods. And this is one of the concerns that has been raised by certain housing activists, is that the East Side may become an area where the placement of new housing is getting denser and denser. And this is unfortunately one of the issues where historic inequities have meant that the construction quality on older housing in the East Side is often much worse than in West Austin, for example. And so whereas in West Austin, you might see very large historical homes, what was often the case in East Austin is that the land has become vastly more valuable than the structure on it. And there's a significant amount of demolition, which has led to certain calls that the area is losing its history as well. These are all issues that are important to the community. However, I argue that the Austin process does give plenty of opportunities for input. And in fact, the continued departure and displacement of historically minority residents in East Austin demonstrates that the existing system of trying to hold on to everything doesn't work here. And housing activism that maybe suited neighborhoods that were in West Austin do not necessarily work in East Austin. Here's another just standard shot that I found while driving through East Austin. And when I say that the opportunity is shrinking, there is a limited number of properties for sale that are like the property here, large and capable of the development of housing that is denser. There are numerous needs that have to be met, but I also wanted to point out that sites like this are still difficult and create significant risks to developers who even try to attempt this. For example, at first glance, just this little strand of trees here, due to new tree protection ordinances, may all have to be preserved. And in that case, what will happen is that the owners of this land essentially didn't know about these, and whatever they planted or kept from decades ago could prevent them from accumulating significant gains. And what you'll see is that rather than participate in the development process, many historical owners in East Austin will try to build something and then find that it's not feasible. And when that happens, property that they may have purchased decades ago for, say, $20,000 might be worth 100 times that, except that it requires a army of lawyers, tree experts, architects and engineers to figure out, and possibly lobbyists to go through a possibly or routinely 5-year process that these people often are just not in a position to undertake. This leads to the inequity of essentially losing control over property that was essentially owned by community members who had plans for those properties. Often people in East Austin, as one of my neighbors once did, was to purchase multiple lots on the same block in order for his family members to hopefully eventually all build houses there and remain together in East Austin. What has happened instead is that one by one, these parcels have been sold as they've increased tenfold, 20-fold in value in the last 30 years. And the reasons you'll see are that often there are failed development applications on those properties. The overwhelming complexity of developing and the tens of thousands of dollars in fees for architects, for review fees, for fees for utility deposits. All of these things are now so complicated. The idea of maintaining local control and residents, taking advantage of their own assets and building to remain in the community, that's essentially impossible now in Austin. It takes an army of people with advanced degrees to even get a single family home permitted in many cases. And what happened on my street was that one of the parcels there had a protected tree, kind of like the one that's just to the left of the sign in this photo. And the radius of protection meant that that lot theoretically was unbuildable. But when he sold this to an out-of-state investor, within a year and a half, there was a new condo built, and the process when I spoke to the builder was that everything hinged on someone who was able to convince the city that the tree was dying anyways. These are very, in my opinion, very arcane arguments to cause someone to have to lose the opportunity to build on their property. And the expectation that all residents will have $50,000 of liquid assets to just drop into the development process and possibly see all of it wasted when your plans go into an endless cycle of review without any approvals is, to me, a major driver in the fact that there isn't more ownership in East Austin, even though this was a community where many of the residents did make all the right choices decades ago, and they possibly even overcame some significant barriers, including the fact that it's possible that these are similar communities where real estate investors often talk about owners who use land as a way to try to provide for their families. There may not have been much advertising of 401ks and such in these communities, but this was how they saved. And to see that opportunity go to people from outside of the area is one manifestation of the inequality that this drives. So one way to visualize this is that, once again, the Austin Tree Protection Ordinance is very, very noble, but together, all of these rules essentially create situations where that previous picture with land that could possibly support dozens of units could be shoehorned back into a single family only community just through the impact of these restrictive housing codes and development guidelines. And so I guess we've already begun some of the discussions about displacement and gentrification, but to take this all back to the superstar city criteria, the issue to me is that overall, the way to look at this is that unless we find a way to stop people from moving into Central Austin or Boston or New York, what we will see is an ongoing competition for housing. And the facts that have been documented are that African-American populations in Austin are moving out at an extremely rapid rate. And so the idea that maintaining the status quo would help just seems wildly off base. And therefore, as we try to look towards the future, I think the passage of, for example, the Proposition A is one way that the city of Austin has created an opportunity to find further zones that may be farther from downtown that could be places to accommodate denser housing and not face this development gauntlet that essentially has been extremely difficult to revise. And so with that, I'm wrap up the presentation and take it to questions. And
we actually did have a few comments, John.
Okay.
If you want me to read it, or if you want to read it from
Sure.
David and Peter. David did say, that's very interesting. Basically, a development tax that prevents you from improving your land, rather than a poll tax that prevents you from voting. Peter also said, but East Austin fought and got excluded from the land development code rewrite that was trying to allow denser housing. I don't know how you want to respond to those two.
That's right. And I'll say thank you, David, for the comment. And I do think that's a good way to look at it, that excessively burdensome regulations create a tax on the cost of living and essentially favor certain people, especially those who are already living in some of our most desirable neighborhoods over newcomers. And Peter, I think we're speaking the same language here when we say East Austin did exclude this. And in many ways, East Austin is already home to many highly sophisticated housing activists on both sides, those that promote development, and those there are like to clarify the situation in East Austin. Many development attorneys and such who operate in the space know that there are certain advocates in East Austin who are trying to turn East Austin into West Austin, and who represent single family owners looking forward to maintaining that single family space and that same enjoyment of privileges due to scarcity of other housing types. And they're like, the fact that East Austin is considered a gentrifying neighborhood does not preclude that neighborhood from also including those who would like to keep their neighborhood as is. And
we did have a few questions that were submitted to us in advance. Jennifer, do you want to read the first one?
Sure. What do you feel about arguments that increased development will only create further gentrification and displacement?
I guess this is that conflict, is that the best way to think about this is that the places that have fought gentrification the hardest are also the places where the gentrification is felt almost most bluntly. When we talk about places like Austin losing minority populations and being displaced, it's happening at a much faster rate than other Texas cities where development might be easier. And the fact is, the research has shown that for residents of the lowest income, Austin is nationally #1 in terms of the highest housing cost burden. And so just looking at it from a pure economic standpoint, these policies have already led to gentrification. And the idea that keeping these neighborhoods single family would keep them from turning over, I think, is a fallacy, especially when you think about the way Texas governments finance themselves. It's through property taxes primarily. And for people who rent, just the property taxes are also passed through by owners who, in many cases, are now paying more in property taxes than in their mortgage. And one of the perspectives on this would be that displacement happens in a kind of multi-step process then, in the sense that scarcity leads to a increase in cost, and these regulations feed that increase in cost and also limit diversification of supply. And what happens is that many longtime residents who bought a home, say in Austin, when it was $35,000, are in a situation where that land on their home that is in East Austin, the taxes on the land portion of that property could be $10,000 a year. It's very frequent now, and that to many is in kind of unsolvable burden that leads people to consider how do they stay within the community when all of the incentives are pointing to how easy it would be if they took a $500,000 payout, which would not allow you to buy a replacement property in Central Austin, but save some for your retirement, and then it allows you to buy a brand new home in the suburbs for half of the price of what is essentially going to be a tear down for the next person here. And that's kind of just a few perspectives on this. And I guess I apologize if I don't have more answers. However, I think the best way to think about this are that in Texas, the possibility of certain interventions such as rent controls and housing subsidies are limited compared to other cities. And therefore, just interventions to increase supply may be our closest shot at addressing the issue.
John, we have a couple more comments in the chat box.
Okay.
Would you like to read one from Marilyn and another one from David?
Sure. Let's see. Let me stop my screen sharing and take a look at the chat box. One second. Let's see.
Marilyn asked, what would you suggest to make Austin more affordable, particularly as we try to accommodate the homeless and people with disabilities such as mental illness?
That's a really good question. One of the ways of thinking about this in the affordable housing space is that housing for people who are formerly homeless and with mental health conditions often requires interventions that are different from straight up just housing affordability issues. Yet they also feed back. It totally makes sense that the research has shown unstable housing contributes to mental health issues by preventing a stable housing situation for recovery and safety. And so the current development situation in Austin has also increased the cost of every type of building. And compared to, say, building the same building with the same number of floors and the same, even just the same parking structure and everything, the costs of compliance and attorneys and all this, and just the risks that contractors and kind of developers bear is all added in. And so given that we are in Texas, and so funding sources are inherently limited compared to what you see in the coast. For example, in California, I believe part of the income taxes on high earners is set aside explicitly for mental health care. What you have in Austin is still the same affordability problem where the construction of supportive housing and all that is vigorously opposed by neighbors. And then once you get through all of this, raising the public or private funds to actually build the structure could mean an additional 10%, 15%, 20% more than building this structure, the identical structure outside of the kind of area with the regulations.
And
Sorry,
David asked,
oh, go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
David asked, what do you expect Code Next version 2 will look like, also known as what are its biggest themes? What policies would you like to see to support densification and smart growth?
That's a really interesting question. As I kind of have been observing efforts to reform the code, I remember that the first attempt for Code Next was attacked by the anti-development forces who had grown very comfortable with their existing regulatory system as an $8 million boondoggle from the government in Austin, and that this was quote unquote against the residents' wishes. And so what was controversial, especially in that case, was that certain corridors and certain regions in Austin would be experiencing increases in density. For example, along major streets, properties might get upzoned to automatically allow more units and such. And this was part of the kind of widely derided $8 million cost, was for consultants to go through and determine, based upon best practices now, what would be the best use of that land. However, what we received as part of that that ultimately failed effort was that many of the most well-connected players in this space and activists had no interest in seeing any increased density, and were willing to do anything they could to torpedo the project. And with respect to any complicated issue, there are arguments, of course, as to why the process might not have been ideal. There are concerns about properties that were possibly upzoned or against the kind of preferences of the neighborhood was very common, for example. But overall, there was an issue where for many of those already there, the increase in density was just not something they wanted. And when we looked, there has essentially been a Code Next replacement that the city quickly passed last year that aimed to try to get something done. And in that case, they targeted many properties that were subject to complex and kind of conflicting rules in the development code of 1986 and its subsequent amendments, just to make these projects a little cheaper to build, but without the highly controversial increase in density. And the status of that is that that passed, but was now kind of struck down in litigation because of certain procedural issues, accusations that there was insufficient public notice for these decisions made by the city. And so what do I predict for the future? I predict that there's going to be, unfortunately, more of the same old, and that pricing will continue to rise in the kind of midst of this relentless opposition and essentially the sophistication of the anti-development forces kind of continues to grow. And what you see in California or the East Coast years ahead is that litigation is frequent on projects. And that may be something coming to Texas, as much as Texas is not for that. You know, the long answer is that we might be seeing that on the horizon, and that can only extend construction timelines even further out, you know, make things even harder to do. I mean, in California, think constructing apartment buildings and such can often be viewed as a you know, decade-long zoning exercise as you wait for the political situation to align to your kind of project needs.
Thanks so much, John. So that was incredibly insightful, so informative. I'm so glad you're able to give that talk and that presentation. We had so much activity in the chat box and questions. So I just wanted to tell everybody, so tonight's event is done. It's 8 p.m. Next Thursday, we'll have Judge Jan Soifer as our speaker. She'll be talking about her path from the classroom to the courtroom to the bench. And we hope you have a great evening. We look forward to seeing you next week. Thanks, John.
Thank you, Stephanie. And thanks again, Cal Alumni Association of Austin and Ivy Plus of Austin.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.